Good morning to everybody on the call. So today we are going to, and I need to share my screen before I go any further. Let me do that. So today we are looking at how conglomerates or groups can leverage AI for predictive analysis. And we will look at it, we will go through some brief definitions of what is a conglomerate, what is predictive analysis, and what is risk management. And then we will look at how AI can be interwoven into this space. So a conglomerate is a large multi-industry company, and it normally consists of several business units that are different and unrelated. It tends to have a hierarchical structure where you have a parent, and this parent owns and controls many subsidiaries, which are legally independent, but you find that financially and strategically, from a policy perspective, they're dependent on that parent. They tend to be very large and regional, even they're global, but I'm going to stick to regional presence, and the portfolio tend to vary across products and services. So with that broad definition of a conglomerate or a group, I pick a few, and I know we have persons from all over the Caribbean here, but I just pick the ones that came to my mind, and I did that deliberately. I didn't go and search, just the ones that I know were listed here. And we have Massey Group from Trinidad, we have Sagicor from Barbados, Goddard's from Barbados, Anson McCall from Trinidad, and Grace Kennedy from Jamaica. And they're just a few that we know. So when we're discussing the risk management perspective and how it's interwoven with AI, we could think of what would it look like in one of these larger companies here in the Caribbean. So what is predictive analytics? Well, predictive analytics is the use of data to predict the future in terms of trends and events. And it is based on the analysis of vast amount of historical data and the scenarios that you can look at. And by doing this, you're able to forecast potential possibilities, scenarios, and this can help you in your decision making. And the predictions could be what we call near future. So it could be like, okay, something that's going to happen within the next couple of days, this couple of hours. So we have something like machinery or system malfunction can be predicted from the data, depending on the data that you have. Or it can be something that goes a little bit more into the future. And that could be something like predicting companies' cash flow or similar type activity. It can be done manually, or it can be done using machine learning algorithms. So when I say manually, I don't mean like somebody with a piece of paper going through adding up and subtracting. And you can probably use something like Excel or Power BI, which are basic tools in this space. And that is what I consider manual. But or you can use machine learning, which is a little bit more automated and advanced. So predictive analytics now, and when we couple that with AI, so it involves using statistical analysis and machine learning. And what are we trying to get at there? We're looking for patterns in the data. We're looking for behaviors. And based on the patterns and the behaviors that we're seeing within the data, we can forecast upcoming events. So organizations can use this to predict, as I said before, potential future outcomes, as well as risk exposure. And we'll see a little bit more about that as we go into the presentation. One thing that we must remember is it is really the analysis of vast amount of data to predict potential risk before they occur. And if just if you can think of it, if you can predict a particular risk occurrence, then you can stop it. You can be proactive in how you deal with that. So that's some of the benefits that we would see coming out as we go on. So that is just a little bit discussion on what is a conglomerate, what is predictive analysis, and then we look at risk management, and then we will put all three of them together. So risk management is the practice of identifying, assessing, and managing potential threats. And I have all opportunities in brackets because it's not always a threat. In some cases, there could be opportunities that can be exploited. And it's really the threat to organization's objectives. Whatever the organization objectives are, we're looking at what can prevent this organization from achieving its objectives. And those are what we will call threats. And opportunity obviously is the opposite of that. You might be looking at something and say, well, you know what, we didn't think of this. So that is an opportunity that we can explore. I mean, like, so those are the two things that we will look at there. Now, risk management applies across all industries and all locations. It is a fundamental practice within good business, within good governance. You really couldn't have an environment that is governed well without having a risk management practice. So it applies across all boards, and no matter the size of the organization. The key thing from risk management, and this will keep coming up as we go through, it anticipates uncertainties. It looks for ways in which we can minimize, mitigate potential adverse impacts to the organization. And we should never really lose the opportunity to chance, I should say. We should never really lose a chance to leverage opportunities so that we can gain that competitive edge if it so presents itself. Now, let's look at the risk management cycle. There are four basic steps that I would talk about. Some persons might define them slightly differently, or they might have more, but for our discussion, this will suffice. Risk identification. You have to understand and you have to know the risks that are inherent within your organization. So when we think of a conglomerate, it might have manufacturing, it might have financial services, it may have energy, something to do with energy, oil and gas, healthcare. You can just think of the task of a risk management function on understanding and identifying all of those risks across those different industries. And if the group company is across different geographies, you would find that the fact that you're in a different geography might introduce another type of risk or might enhance existing risks that you know before from a different geography. So we've identified all of our risks, we have to assess it, right? And the standard way of assessing risk tend to be, you look at what is the likelihood of an event occurring in the space. And if an event were to occur, so if you had a risk event occurring, what will be the impact to the organization? And remember, we say risk management is that practice of mitigating or minimizing those adverse impacts to the organization achieving its objectives. So we say, what would be the impact? How would this impact the organization in an adverse way from achieving its objectives? So we have the likelihood and we have the impact. And they tend to be a mathematical formula of how people combine those two. I dare say it doesn't matter. And I say that with some reservations. However, in an organization and in a group company, you must use the same formula of combining your impact and your likelihood. So if we had a conglomerate that had healthcare and let's say had manufacturing, if healthcare multiply the impact by the likelihood to determine what was the risk assessment, then the manufacturing has to do that same calculation. It can't go and add it, or it can't raise it to the second power and divide by 4. It has to use the same calculation. And why I say it has to use the same way of assessing, because at the top of the house, the parent company would have to have a way that they can augment and the entire risk profile. So you can have a risk profile by the particular industry that they're in, but then you want to have a risk profile at the top of the house. And you can't add apples and oranges. You got to add apples and apples. So that's why you should have the same way of assessing the rents. Now, I like to talk about in terms of risk assessment. There's one factor that I like to add in. You don't see it a lot in literature. It exists, but you don't see it that often, but I like it. And that is volatility. And volatility reflects the speed at which an organization will feel the impact if the risk event were to occur, right? And you might have a risk event that that you might say is the likelihood is very low. And let's say the impact is moderate to high. And when you combine those two things, you might say, okay, this is not something that we need to worry about too much because this puts us in the overall risk assessment as a very low issue. But if you were to add the volatility then onto that equation, you might find that whilst the likelihood might be very low, almost remote, and the impact is moderate to high, you will feel that impact very quickly if you were to consider the volatility. One example of that I like to use is, I don't know how many of us remember when, I think it was BP. I hope I don't get it wrong. I think it was BP that had an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago, maybe 20 years by now, maybe that long. Anyway, they had an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And when I looked at all the ratings that were came available after that particular incident, they did the risk assessment, but it was one of those things that they had risk assessed as remote. The likelihood was remote, and it is, and that there's nothing wrong with that assessment. The impact was high, but they never consider how soon they would start to feel the impact from that remote thing occurring. And had that been considered, they would have had a different response, right? So that takes us nicely into response and your risk response. How are you going to respond to this risk? How are you preparing to respond to this risk? Now, there are generally 4 areas that we tend to look at from a response perspective. We can avoid the risk. Now, in many cases, that is probably not practical because avoiding a risk typically means that you're not going to be involved in the particular activity that gives rise to that risk. And that is not probably something that you tend to be able to do very often because there are a number of risks that are inherent in business. And so to avoid risk tend not to be something that you can do pretty easily. The other one is sharing of the risk. So a typical way one can share risk is by insurance. So you might look at a particular risk assessment, a particular risk event, and say, okay, based on this assessment that we can share. So let's go and get an insurance policy so that in the event this risk were to materialize, we are covered from that perspective. The other one that you can do, which is where we spend lots of our time, persons in risk management, persons in internal audit, and elsewhere, spend lots of the time is on mitigating risk. And that is where you develop controls to manage the risk. So you go there and you look at the controls, and it could be people, process, technologies, and you develop these controls that would bring the impact, the overall risk assessment down to the level that is acceptable. And that takes us into our 4th option that we have for risk response, and that is accepting the risk. Now, technically speaking, one should only accept risks that are within the risk appetite of the organization. So that means that the organization should have defined a risk appetite, right? So those are the 4 sort of basic responses to risk. And then you have risk monitoring and review. You constantly have to monitor your environment, look at changes in legislation, changes within the physical environment, changes within the social environment, and see how that impact your risk assessment, see how that impact the risk identified, because it might give rise to new risks. And in recent times, there have been so many new and emerging risks that one have to consider in your risk management practice. So you have to do that monitoring constantly and reviewing what is your assessment. So this is an ongoing process. This is a cycle that constantly is moving. It doesn't stop. You don't do it now and say, well, I'm done. It's a constant activity within the risk management space. Now, let's look at some risk categories, and this is just to help us frame our conversation. You've got financial risk, which are things like credit risk. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, operational risk, and this is where a lot of us spend lots of time dealing with the operational risk. system failures, you can have cyber attack, you have third-party risks, you have risks associated with HR, and these can be risks where you don't have the requisite number of persons to complete the tasks that have to be completed, or it could be a case where you have the number, but you don't have the right skill, you don't have the right competencies, the right skill set. And so, there's a mismatch between what the organization has to do to sustain itself and with the staffing and the skill and the talent it has available. Process inefficiencies. Processes can be grossly inefficient. Something taking a day to complete when it can be done in half an hour. So those are the sort of things that we look at in operational risk. Business continuity, don't need to spend too much time on that. So we have in operational risk, we spend a lot of time looking at people, process, and technology. And then you have strategic risk. This is really looking at how can the organization exist and be profitable within the environment it is in. What are the competitive pressures? Now we find that innovation, to keep alive, we have to be constantly innovative. So are they able to innovate? Do they have the structures around them to allow them to do the level of innovation necessary? And we can look at reputational damage. You just need to have one on ethical practice within an organization if it were to occur, becoming public knowledge. And we know with social media now, things are spread far and wide, and things that might have been overlooked 20 years ago, 25 years ago aren't now. And that whole availability of information makes it very important for organizations to make sure that they are protecting their reputation. And so we look at unethical practices in that space. And if you had a product, if you develop and launch a new product, or you enhance an existing product and it fails, that could also damage the reputation. So those are some of the risks, some of the things that we will look at when we look at strategic risks. And we have compliance risks. When you think of a group of companies, it may have something in financial services, or it might have something in oil and gas or healthcare. And those industries tend to be highly regulated. There are lots of laws and regulations that you must follow and couple in there. So you have to make sure that you are on top of your compliance task, and that you're not exposing yourself, by that I mean the organization, to scrutiny and fines from regulators. And then environmental risks. We know natural disasters have taken on a whole new presence. A couple of years ago, you would have heard of one or two, but now every day there's some natural disasters. So you need to understand, based on where my companies are spread, based on the industry that my companies are in, what are the disasters that would hamper me achieving my objective. We have climate change. And if you're in something like farming, or if you're in something like gas and oil, yeah, you got to be concerned about pollution and the probability that you can be held liable for pollution-related activities. Now, what are the challenges we experience in risk management? Uncertainty. We have a whole set of risk in front of us, and we're trying to measure and determine if this risk would occur, and if it would occur, what's the frequency of occurrence, and if it were to occur, what would be the cost to your organization? So that uncertainty is an issue that we have to overcome, and different companies are able to manage it to certain degrees of success, but we haven't got to space where we can say, yep, everybody is managing this very well, and we know that we are very clear and concise and precise in terms of determining the timing of a risk exposure, a risk, event, and the impact. And then resource constraint. When you just think of a company that, a group of companies where you have a vast variety of industry presence, healthcare, education, financial services, retail, and you don't have to pull all this together in terms of being able to understand what is your risk profile. You can see that it can be costly in terms of from a time perspective and personnel. And you will really have to have persons skilled and talented in risk management. Not only risk management, also need to understand the the peculiarities of the particular industry that they're looking at. And human bias is another one that that is there as a challenge in risk management. Especially when you've been doing it for a very long time, you may say, "Oh, this nothing is going to happen here. We got this covered," and so you can underestimate the impact of a risk or underestimate the likelihood of occurrence, or you can overestimate it. And overestimating risk or underestimating risk have the same sort of financial impact. Um, they both could cost the company some funds. So, because if you overestimate a risk, you are going to end up paying for some measure of protection for that, and you might be overspending on the protection phase. So, as I like to say, you might be spending $100 to protect five, and when you underestimate, you have $100 to protect, but you're only spending $5. So you can see the mismatch there. And then there are emergency risks. We mentioned climate change before. We have artificial intelligence in there as an emerging risk. I don't know if we can say it's emerging. I think it is here, but many organizations still have to enhance their practice from a risk management perspective for artificial intelligence. And talking from a risk management perspective for artificial intelligence, it 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 is like a two-edged sword, because artificial intelligence presents additional risk management activities for the risk management team and the risk management practice within organizations. But on the other side, those organizations can use artificial intelligence to make what they're doing in risk management easier, less costly, and more productive. And that is the area that we're going to spend our time on. We're not going to spend a lot of time on artificial intelligence risk. We're going to spend our time on how risk management can be enhanced using artificial intelligence. So how can we address the challenges that we just saw there from a risk management perspective with AI? So remember, we talked about the risk management cycle. So one of the first things we look at was risk identification. Now, right now, when you're trying to identify the risk associated with a company, you have to read, you have to go through procedures, documentation, laws and regulations, and that could be a very arduous task. But with AI, you can use AI algorithms that can analyze structured and unstructured data in real time. So it's doing it same time, it's doing it real time. It's not coming back to you 2 or 3 weeks later. It's in real time, and it can take information from various sources. It can take information internal, social media, industry, and external news feeds. So it can get from a variety of sources. It can also get things about your company, your structure, your location, where you operate, the sort of things. And it can analyze that information. And from that information, it can say to you, these are the risks that your organization are exposed to. So you can get something done for you probably within 5-6 hours, depending on the capacity of the algorithm and the compute power it has to do its work. You can even get it in less than that, depending on the compute power and the algorithm, all those things. You can get your risk inventory in a very short space of time. If you were doing that manually, it can take weeks and weeks and weeks, right? And the tools that can be used in this space with, natural language processing, you can look at things like emails that are unstructured, laws, regulations. These are all the unstructured stuff it can look at and be able to help you understand what are your risks. And you would find too as well that machine learning models can detect anomalies in your operational data. So you allow it to run against your general ledger, against your inventory system, against all the systems that within your organization, and it can highlight to you system failures or fraud. So we see here that we can use predictive analytics to analyze vast amount of data. It does, and when we do that analysis, it gives us the potential risks that the organization is exposed to. So we have our risk register, and that allow us to be a lot more proactive in developing a response measure for any risk exposure. So that is one of the areas we can use AI, particularly predictive analytics in risk management. That's risk identification. So we can also look at it in risk assessment. Now just think of automating the collection of the data. So we're collecting the similar data in terms of what are the financial results, what are incidents that happened in the past, what were the costs associated with, let's say, a cyber incident, with a denial of service attack, how many were experienced in by industry. So how many were experienced, say, in healthcare, how many were experienced in banking, what was the cost associated with that? Providing that information is public, of course, right? So that collecting that data, then you can score your risk and have a nice report saying these are the risk assessment for the risk that was identified previously within your environment. So one of the fundamental things here is the faster turnaround times for risk assessment. And you have accuracy and you have consistency. And remember, we talked about when you're doing your risk assessment, you got to use the same algorithm in terms of coming up with your final risk disposition. In this scenario here, we don't have to worry about that because the system is the AI will be doing all of that. And at the end of the day, you'll get spit out for you your risk assessment. And you can cut and slice and dice it however you want. You can slice it by risk category, you can slice it by industry, you can slice it by geography, and you have that in a matter of minutes or hours, as opposed to trying to get it over weeks and months, right? And you find that with AI, the result is a more accurate result. It can look at a larger range of factors and data points. So when you have to make a decision in terms of how you would treat a particular risk, you have a better informed output. And so your decision making will be richer because you have more information on which that decision is made. Risk response. And I like this one particularly from a risk response perspective. Remember we talk about different risk response. You can avoid, you can accept, you can share, or you can mitigate using controls. Now, using AI and all the data that you've collected over a period of time, and you can look at from industries or where have you can now do some scenario analysis. So you're saying, assuming that risk event 1 is going to occur on a Friday, is going to impact 20 departments, whatever. And that scenario then helps you to understand what would be the impact to the organization if a particular risk were to occur. When you have that, and it's based on a tremendous amount of data, right? When you have that, it means that your response that you make to risk are more effective than they would have been if you were doing it in a manual disposition, right? So you might find yourself saying, before we used to mitigate a particular risk, so we had our controls in place, we did our control testing, and we had a whole regiment behind mitigating this particular risk with controls. But when we do the scenario is saying to us, well, you know what? This risk, based on all the data that we have collected in the past associated with this particular activity, doesn't really occur, or if it does occur, the impact is minimum and is within the range that you can accept. So you move now from saying, you know what, we used to have controls around this particular risk, but we're going to accept it. And don't forget, I must add, when you accepting the risk, you don't put it in a box and leave it and don't ever look at it. Remember, we have monitoring and review as one of the features within the risk management cycle. Those risks would obviously come back up again when you're doing monitoring and review. And if there'd be no change in circumstance, they will continue to be accepted. And likewise with the scenario testing, there might be some things that you might have decided that you were going to insure because you thought it was the best thing for you to do given the potential impact and likelihood. The scenario might say to you, you know what, you don't need to insure this. So you save now on that insurance premium. You just need to implement some controls, and here are here are the controls that you can implement. And one would have to weigh up the cost of the controls, obviously, with the cost of insurance, because you don't want now to go and spend more on the insurance on the controls than you would spend on the insurance, right? Monitoring and review. So real-time monitoring and alerting. AI can help us to continually monitor various data factors, like risk factors, sorry, data streams, internal and external. And I find risk monitoring particularly tend to get into that first line of defense round, at that first line where things happen. So let me give you an example why I mean like that. For example, if we think of a network detection and response tool. So you employ that in your network, and that tool sees that suddenly, out of the blue, a number of persons within the organization, so a number of devices within the organization is sending data to a particular website, a particular website, a particular device, right? With real-time monitoring, the NDR would say, network detection and response would say, hey, this behavior, because remember, with AI, you're looking at behavior, you're looking at patterns and the sort of things. This behavior is not common within this network. This pattern of data flow is outside of the norm. We've never seen this before. And this website that they're going to is not a business related website. This website doesn't correspond with the type of business that this organization is doing. So the AI now will kick in and say, well, you know what? We're going to block this. So it not only monitors in real time, it would block the activity from occurring and then send an alert. And then somebody within the system environment would be able to look and determine whether it was truly malicious activity or whether it was just a new activity that is first time occurring. So you can see how AI will really help in this risk management space. It's not within the risk management practice per se for monitoring, but it is within that first line of defense list of activities. And I put on fraud here and compliance. I mentioned compliance before, but fraud detection is key because you look around and you see a lot of the incidents that happen with companies are related to fraud. I mean, and by using AI to identify patterns, behaviors, and anomalies, organization is able to detect possible fraudulent activities, and that can make sure that the fraud prevention, and detection activities are directed at the more critical area. And again, fraud detection tends to be within that first line phase as well. Compliance. No, how can AI help with compliance? You got to stay compliant, right? And laws and regulations change. Processes within organizations change. So you can have your AI working to say, okay, these are the laws and regulations that you are required to be compliant with. These are the changes you're making within your organization. And based on the data that we have and all the predictions that we can do, if you continue to change this particular process or this particular procedure, you can possibly be going into the realm of non-compliance with this particular regulation, right? And that is a huge win. And because so many times I have seen scenarios where you made a change that seems to be right, good, it improves efficiency, it may save you costs, what have you. And somewhere along the line, the associated regulation was probably misapplied or not understood. And then you find yourself 6 months down the road where you have a non-compliant issue and you have to double back now and do a correction. With this and using AI, one is able to spot those things. One is able to predict those things from the data before they occur. And so really does save time and cost in terms of not having to retrace your steps to correct something. So let's look at how we could apply AI-driven predictive analytics by risk category. So we can look at it by risk category. We're going to look at it also by business sector. So operational risk, and we're not going to do all the risk categories. I'm just going to do 2 or 3 of them because of timing. Operational risk, we can monitor day-to-day operations. So it makes the management of operational risk, that ongoing monitoring of operational risk, you can enhance that by having monitoring of day-to-day operations. You can identify process inefficiencies, and you can have continuous scanning of for system vulnerabilities and suspicious activities. You can, based on data flows and behavioral patterns, you can predict breaches, and you can also automate countermeasures. And I would have mentioned something like that when we talked about the data flow in the previous slide. So predictive models can identify potential delays if you are looking at it from a supply chain perspective. You know, it can feed in all the shipping issues that are out there in the world. It can look at your shipping containers, where they're coming from, which shipping line they're using, when they're going to be shipped, and it can say to you, well, given all this information, you're going to have a delay on component 1 or component 2 if you're into manufacturing. Likewise, you can have AI tied to certain pieces of equipment in a manufacturing environment, and that can talk to you about whether or not this piece of equipment is about to fail, it's about to crash out, because it looks at the behaviors, it looks at the number of hours working, fault, whatever, and it can give you that. So that allows you to really have an understanding of where your risk can possibly be coming from, and allow you to be proactive in dealing with that. So that's from an operational risk perspective. Financial risk, I think that's one of the fairly obvious ones. You can analyze market trends, look at credit risk and your investment portfolios. So you can have real-time insights into your financial disposition. So you pull all those things together and you can be looking at it on the screen, and you can see how your financial status is changing with that level of data analytics. Now, if we look at it from sector, in the financial sector, we talk about fraudulent transactions. It can help you with the credit risk. So I guess most of you guys might have logged on to, lots of banks now in the Caribbean are saying to you that you can log on and apply for a loan, and you have the loan in less than 3 or 4 minutes, right? And it does happen in some cases. And you probably go, how can they do that? Well, what they have done is they've used models to determine persons' credit worthiness. So these models these models are fed vast historical data. So it looks at age, occupation, credit history. It looks at all the other things associated with credit risk, and it can say, yep, this person is a viable option, and so you get your loan in 2 or 3 minutes, right? Before that would have taken many weeks of taking all this stuff to the bank and going through it. And you can upload your information as well. You upload the information, and we talk about natural language processing. You upload your information, the system can process that information and come up with whether or not you're a good credit risk. In healthcare, we can look at predicting disease outbreaks, optimizing patient care, and managing supply chain risks. So what I like in there is the optimization of patient care, because a person might have so many things going on, and the particular specialist might be dealing with his or her area. And it could almost appear to be in isolation, but if you have all this information coming together, then you are able to get a more comprehensive view of the issue, and so a more comprehensive treatment plan. Manufacturing, we talk about supply chain disruptions before. We look to see we can use the data that help production processes and optimize those. And in the energy sector, you can, again, equipment failure, you can look at your environmental risk. How is what you're doing impacting the environment? Are you within the allocated limits set by the environmental regulator, those sort of things? And you can look at how you can optimize your resource allocation. And in retail, you can forecast demand, manage your inventory, and again, detect fraud. Fraud comes out in many, many aspects because that is one of the key risks that really plagues many large organizations. Now, we talk about what we can achieve if we had AI, if we were using AI within a risk management space, and specifically predictive analytics, right? So we see all the good things that we can get and how we can improve our risk management practice, but there are implementation challenges. And we need to understand what they are, so that we don't try to implement it within a risk management phase and don't get the benefits we're after because we have not effectively considered the implementation challenges. So, as I said, there are many great benefits to doing it. So, data quality and availability. Giggle. I know, like when I first started in the technology space, we always used to be told, when I was at university, giggle, garbage in, garbage out. So the AI system is only as good as the data on which it's trained on, right? It has to be trained. You have to prompt it, you have to feed it, you have to feed it data, you have to prompt it, and it has to be trained on this data. So if you have data that is poor quality, so you have fields missing, you have, it's just bad quality data or it's incomplete, then you can get inaccurate risk assessments, you can get flawed predictions. So it might say to you, this is the list of your risk, but it's not a complete list, or it's not accurate, right? And if you're doing risk assessment, you can have flawed predictions and stuff like that. Now, in terms of conglomerates and group companies, this is going to be especially an issue that they will need to consider because you have data coming from diverse business units and locations. You have, you may have healthcare, education, retail, manufacturing, and the list goes on, coming together, feeding data. So you have to make sure that your standard of data collection and your standard of data governance across the conglomerate is equal, so that you know that when you get this data in and you start modeling on this data, that you really do have data that can really be useful in your predictions. And you have to consider ethical considerations. Data privacy is a key. If you have customer data, and you're using it in data models, you have to stop and ask yourself, am I using this data in a way that is allowed by the data privacy regulation within your jurisdictions, right? So, and that will be especially key for a conglomerate because you might be collecting data in country one, country two, country three, and so on. And they might have their own data privacy, data protection legislations. And so you have to make sure that when you collect the data from all those different jurisdictions and you bring them into your parent company for your data modeling and for use with AI, you got to make sure that you're not in any way breaching any of those regulations. So that is one thing that you have to be very, very cognizant of. And that is an ethical consideration, as we will call it. The other thing that you got to be concerned about is model bias. And when I say model bias, what I'm talking about there is, if, for example, let me think of a very simplistic example. If, for example, you have collected data, sales data, and your average sales data in this collection that you're training your model on, let's say your average sale was 10,000 US, right? So your average sale in this particular data that you've collected is 10,000 US. And now you want to use that model to predict behaviors, to predict activity in another environment. And you say, oh yeah, we have a model, we can use it over there. But the average sale over there is only $500. You can see where you would have a mismatch, and the results could be tarnished, right? So you got to make sure that there are no built-in biases and the other biases that were popular in the media recently. That you got to make sure that you don't lend, that you fall prey to those ones, right? And one of the things that organization must do is to make sure that the AI systems are within good practice norms, right? And by that I mean that the number of jurisdictions that have established AI governance principles, AI governance rules. Some countries have done that, and so as an organization, you got to make sure that you're operating within those good practice norms. The one that I have looked at and I tend that I like, although I say I like, but the one that I tend to recommend people look at is the one from NIST. Um, I think it's NIST AI 100. So that is one. And I think the European Union had issued something. I am not very familiar with that one, but I thinking that they have issued something. But there are a number of practices out there. I know I heard on a news clip where I think it was Jamaica. I hope I don't speak out of turn here, but I think it was Jamaica who was talking about developing AI's governance standard for the country. But that is something that one will have to consider and make sure that you're operating within those good practices. Um, if you want to use AI and you got to gather information from within your organization, if your organization has a lot of legacy systems, and legacy means, oh, for me, very old systems. They're not talking about systems that were recently developed that can tend to integrate many things easily with, with API calls and stuff like that. Systems that are a couple of years old. If you're trying to do that, if you're trying to integrate AI tools with those legacy systems, it can be a very complex and dare say costly activity. And when you have a conglomerate, you can see why that would be, because it's going to be large, it's going to be diverse, and there are many things that have to come into the picture. So one thing that you have to make sure is that there's an alignment between the technology capabilities, the organizational goals, and the risk management strategy. If you don't have that alignment, you probably would have some challenges in really seeing the benefits of any AI tool, or even trying to integrate it within the existing systems. And they could be also, we move on, there could also be a skill gap. You have to have persons who understand risk management as well as AI, and who can bridge the gap between those two things, right? If you don't have that, it's recommended that you look at the talent and develop the talent. So that would be a having the right talent is a key success factor, and you will have to see how you can invest in getting that talent available. So we've reached a conclusion. So we see that AI-driven predictive analytics presents new opportunities in risk management for conglomerates or large companies, groups, right? But there's some things that we must, and what are some of these benefits? The accuracy and completeness of risk identification, allows you to be proactive in risk management strategies, thus helping you to improve your decision making and enhancing operation efficiency. It helps to detect risk events. So being able to by proactively monitoring, you can detect risk events. And so that early detection allows you to preempt if it hasn't quite started, or stop a risk event from materializing. And you can also automate some of your risk responses in some cases. So while it could be a challenge to implement AI within the risk management practice, there are many rewards that can be gained. And so it is, I consider it to be a good tool, very good tool for large companies, conglomerates who are trying to make sure that the existence is sustained and they continue to grow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So, this was a very, very good, comprehensive presentation this morning that truly looked at risk management and how we use AI. I think it was really, really well done. So, thank you so much. I want to say that. Actually, before I get to that, let me tell our participants in the room, I know it's 12:35 now. So what we'll do is we will want to engage the conversation with Patricia, simply because having someone who actually worked in industry, who brings that practical experience so that you can engage in a conversation that's real is something that we would value. So we'll have an opportunity to still discuss with her, which means we may not go to a break today. After we complete the Q&A this morning, we'll go straight into our panel one, okay? Because I really think that this is a lot of great information and we need to dissect it a little bit. So let me say, Patricia, one of the first things that really, really struck me this morning was when you spoke about adding volatility to the equation when you're looking at your AI risk management systems. And that is because, as you had explained already, it's challenging for people to get it right when you're trying to identify your risks, much less when you're now trying to assess the likelihood of it and then the impact. And now there is this additional element, which you have pointed with an excellent example of where BP had in fact identified the risk. They had assessed the likelihood of it happening, which was rare, but that in the event it did happen, how much time would they have to respond? And because they had not considered that, it meant that the disaster was as bad as it was with the Deepwater Horizon project out there. So that I think that was a really, really brilliant example for us to understand why managing risk is so important and how detailed it needs to be, and therefore being able to use AI and machine learning in that context to help us is going to be really good. And also the other thing you had pointed to, which is the ability to have that information now be ready within 5 to 6 hours, where before it will take a risk management team sometimes weeks to be able to pull all the data together to do the risk assessment and all of that. I also thought this idea of the countermeasures that are automated with the AI was an incredible thought. Now, it can be good because certainly it can prevent a bad thing from happening that's entering. It recognizes this is foreign and stops it. But then sometimes you're improving your system, you make changes. You have to know to tell the AI that what is genuine now, what you were doing. So to me, that was an interesting way. Of course, as you pointed to, data quality is key in all of this because it is how you feed the AI. This is how you train it to be able to respond, and therefore, giggle. Give it garbage, the predictability is going to be wrong. The assessments are going to be wrong, and you're not going to have, the outcomes that you want. And as you say, when we talk about conglomerates, it means within each subsidiary, you have to be looking at your data quality and how do you develop those systems that allow for the comparison so that at the parent organization level, you can have those proper systems in place. So that's my summary to be able to say how much I appreciate the presentation this morning. Now we do have some comments in the chat because I think quite a few people have been very engaged with your presentation so far. So let me go to the top. So there was a contribution from Noek. Noek was talking about the risk management in terms of whether you would discuss risk transfer. So Novak, do you want to unmute and share what your thought is in terms of risk transfer? Because I mentioned, so Patricia spoke about it in the context of using insurance and all that. Was there something different you had in mind?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks again for the opportunity to ask. So I dropped off for a couple of minutes while I was switching devices, so I don't know if I missed it. So what I was asking, whether you sort of went into the concept of risk transfer as opposed to risk sharing. Now, risk sharing would mean, as you said, the insurance means that you do not completely remove the risk from your responsibility, but risk transfer would be, an example would be engaging a third-party organization where they are now contractually obligated to take that risk away from you. So like, I would just give an example of cybersecurity risk. There are third-party cybersecurity companies can engage, and they would basically remove that particular risk profile from their portfolio by transferring it onto a third-party entity. So I was just wondering if you touched that, or if I missed it. Apologies if I did.
Could you repeat? Could you repeat again, please? Just the last sentence.
Oh, no, just the concept of, for example, like cybersecurity risk, where you can engage a third-party organization. So now you completely transfer the risk, the cybersecurity risk, onto that third-party organization, although they are engaged to deliver services for your company. So it's not necessarily sharing, because I mean, we're probably getting into the fine details here, but in in this particular example, you're actually removing that particular risk from your company onto the third party. Now, that cybersecurity is just one
Okay.
example, but
Okay.
the concept of transfer versus sharing.
I personally do not use the phrase risk transfer, because I fundamentally believe, and I'll tell you later on why I believe that you cannot transfer risk. Risks are inherent within a particular entity based on the activity. So for example, let's use the example with your cybersecurity notion. You say we transfer it to another company who take on the responsibility. So they're doing whatever it is that you were doing, they're doing it for you. If there is a cybersecurity breach, if there's a cybersecurity incident, unless you're going to say to me that the company to whom the activity was transferred is going to be held liable legally, uh, the reputational issues are going to be on that company, then I can say, yeah, you transfer it. But in reality, the company who would have said, okay, I'm transferring or outsourcing this activity to company 1, 2, or 3, if there's a breach, it's still be the problem. They still have the fines to account for, and it goes on. If you look at the cybersecurity acts across the region, if you look at the central bank regulations and the financial services regulations, it's very clear in those regulations and in those acts that you cannot transfer risk. You are the owner of the risk. So I don't use the term transfer at all, because I think it has a connotation that is not totally correct. But that is my position, and I'm open up for anybody who can say otherwise.
Yeah, I understand, Patricia. And whilst the risk management models have all had transfer as one of the ways in which you manage risk, I totally get what you're saying, because even as Novak was explaining the concept of transferring to a cybersecurity company, in my mind, I'm thinking, but no, that risk is still mine. I will manage it by having a cybersecurity company be responsible for looking at what's happening and using prevention measures and all that. But the risk is still mine, that if it does happen, then the impact is going to be on my organization, and it is for me to handle. So I get that point. Thanks so much. And In the chat too, we saw, just to remind everyone, we still want to get your feedback from today. So I saw Monique did put the link in the chat for you to be able to click and give us your feedback on the survey. So please do so. Right, so Edward Millington in the chat was also saying that in support of your point of ensuring that you use best practice models in ensuring that you incorporate standards. And he pointed to ISO 42001 and he put the link in the chat as well for persons. See, there was another question from Novak. Would the models used for risk purposes have a published rate of false positives that the organization can accept?
Could you, I didn't get that. Could you go again, please?
Would the models used for risk purposes have a published rate of false positives that the organizations can accept?
If you're using a publicly available model to do something, I would expect that. If you're not, if you built the model yourself, then you would have to determine what is your false positive rate. But you would only have that published if it is a publicly available model that one can buy and use.
So, Kamala, can I just follow up on that question, please?
Sure.
All right, thanks again. I don't mean to dominate the discussion, right? So I'm
That's
going to give
okay.
an example to illustrate the point. So I'm with the University of the West Indies, and we have a third-party tool to detect plagiarism in academic writing. Now, this third-party tool identified that checks for plagiarism would include an AI detection score, but there's also a degree of false positive detection there, where students who written their own work can be detected as false positives. And what we needed to do, we needed to make sure that via training education policy, that our lecturers don't punish the students by using that particular AI detection score without further assessment. So really, I was kind of going a long way around to the point where when you're using these models for risk assessment, and there's a possibility of false positives or incorrect information or incorrect analyses, how would you necessarily treat with it if you have a similar approach at the conglomerate, through the lens of conglomerate management?
Well, I guess you will have to understand what is the false positive score and how you plan to treat to it. So you might say, if a score, let's say that 10 is the highest, which is it's bad. If you're between 0 and 1, you might say, let's ignore that. If it's between 2 and 5, you might say, okay, let's penalize the person by deducting, and using your example, deducting a 30%, whatever risk factor or something, but you will have to determine how you would treat to the scoring once you understand what that score means. But what I was saying to you, that risk, that false positive score or any other type of scoring like that where you get on a model only really occurs if you have a model that was purchased or a model that is publicly available. If you are developing your own models, you will not have that. You will have to determine in your mind the level of correctness of that. And that can happen when you're training and prompting the model. You can come up with what those numbers would be, but it wouldn't be something that would be published because it would be a private model.
Thank you very much.
That makes sense to you, Novak? It's Novak, right?
Yes, Novak.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Thank you very much. So, I mean, my question really was, how would conglomerates sort of deal with this situation, given that in my example, it's relatively low risk because it's just one particular student or a small group of stakeholders, and potentially legal action. But in the context of a conglomerate where the implication could be millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, false positives can have this sort of snowball effect. So I'm just curious, in your experience, how you all would have dealt with it in using or looking at AI models for risk management.
You have to, like, if I go back to like the credit risk models I'm sort of familiar with more, you look at the probability of it occurring and the rating, and you adjust your final result based on that. So something that you have to think about and discuss it and work out how you're going to apply it, but you have to have a mechanism that is agreed up front and is well documented to apply that level of uncertainty back there.
Okay, so we do have a couple other comments in the chat. There were some from Edward as well, but I want to go to a question from Charlene. So we'll take that and then we could come back to the contribution from Edward. Charlene's question was towards the end. She asked, how do we maintain data sovereignty though, particularly when most AI infrastructure is controlled by foreign tech companies? Is data sovereignty important in these early stages of AI development in the region? What are your thoughts?
Data sovereignty is always important. You have to understand what are the particular rules, I can say rules around data sovereignty, and make sure that you are not violating those rules. You can have infrastructure that is controlled by a foreign tech company, but you can also have that infrastructure implemented within your organization, and use it within within a jurisdiction that allows you to move it there. So unless it is hard to say that this is how you do it, because you have to look at it circumstance by circumstance. What is the requirement from a regulatory or law perspective for data sovereignty? You would always, you can move data to France, but it is still your data. You still have sovereignty over that data. So it may be a case where, as part of the definition of sovereignty, you can't let your data reside anywhere else. In that scenario, then you will have to think carefully about where the data is going to be housed. But sovereignty, you always know your data is yours, no matter where it goes, but it's how you understand the regulation and how you protect it when it moves. So it's not a black and white thing, and you have to look at it case by case.
The challenge this week, Patricia, has been that a lot of our speakers referred to the fact that if you're using systems like Microsoft Suite and Google, some of these, the information you put in there, it's no longer yours. Even if you have a Microsoft Suite system that you have purchased, you have licenses and all that, the US law will be, if they ask for that data, that the data will be made available to US agencies without informing you that that data has been so used.
Well, and that is true. I mean, like, take for example, you don't even have to have a Microsoft Suite. You might host your systems in the US, right? So they're your systems. They're not Microsoft. They're your system, and they're in the US. And if the US government have a legal reason to get the data, they'll get it. So I mean, I tend not to get too worked up about data and getting regulators getting data, because I understand that even if your data is in Barbados or some other Caribbean location, and there is a good legal reason why somebody wants the data, country to country, they're gonna share it, right? So it's one of those things that we can put all the guardrails in place, but a subpoena comes through the foreign office of this country, speaks to the foreign office of that country, and the data is gone, and the data is shared.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So then I come to Edward's contribution in the chat. He said, AI governance is so critical, but it highlights existing risks, existing governance structures surrounding data, cyber, ESG, social responsibility, and risk management also. Therefore, we need to get these things right as AI integration and automation increases and the risks surrounding AI grows due to such integration and fewer governance risk controls. And then
I could not have said it better. I agree. I
yeah.
agree, and I think traditionally we in the Caribbean region, a governance is still in an immature state. You know, financial services are probably ahead of most because they were highly regulated. But you go into retail, you go
Right.
into what frightens me, you go into healthcare, and a lot of those things are not, the governance around it is not there. So Edward is absolutely correct and spot on.
Yeah. So, okay, well, Patricia, I want to say thank you so very much. This has been truly, truly excellent for us to see risk, which is such a fundamental part of what we do, and how we can use AI to help us in this respect. We are actually just 5 minutes to the start of the next panel. So I would say thank you so much, and we will go into doing our checks with the next panel and see that we can hear and see them to get started. Thank you so much. And I
Thank
hope
you.
you on so that you can continue to
I will.
contribute.